Hey y'all, Coach Inthefight here doing our new moon report for the third month of the year 2021, talking about the month Sivan. And in this class, we're going to talk about when this month starts. We're going to talk about when the Sabbath day will change to. We're going to talk about some significant events of the third month, including the Feast of First Fruits or Pentecost. We're going to talk about the journey of the children of Israel and the importance of the third month in relationship to the covenant. But we're going to start off talking about the calendar and how it is that we know that we are in the third month. Now, for that, we're going to go to the book of Enoch the prophet, translated by Richard Lawrence, and we're going to drop down to chapter 71, which starts the book of the revolutions of the luminaries of heaven. It is this section of the book of Enoch that we learn how our Father's sacred calendar works. These days, you often hear about people talking about calendars. I personally believe it's because of the importance of the feast days. And while you have people who are trying to make sure that we understand when the feast days are, you also have people who are trying to steer us astray and have us worshiping on the wrong days. Now, the latter, those who are trying to steer us off of the correct feast days, are quick to try to dismiss the book of Enoch. In fact, that's the first thing that they'll do because, like we said, the book of Enoch is actually where we learn how the Father's sacred calendar works. And without the book of Enoch, they can just make stuff up and create the calendars as they will, and that is exactly what they're doing. They're trying to convince you that the book of Enoch is not inspired right before they try to peddle their false calendars. Now, one thing that should prove to you the legitimacy and the inspiration of the book of Enoch is chapter 2. Now, it is a short chapter. Actually only has one verse in it. But notice how in the book of Jude, in verses 14 and 15, that entire chapter is actually quoted. Jude, who was the brother of the Messiah, starts off talking about Enoch, the seventh from Adam, then goes on to restate the entire chapter. And we're looking here at the King James Version, but I bet if I find a better translation, it would actually be a direct quote. So, if the book of Enoch is not inspired scripture, then why is the brother of the Messiah quoting it in the New Testament? No, not only is the book of Enoch inspired scripture, it is actually the first scripture ever written. And even Moses quoted Enoch several times. But let's go on. And let's come back over to the book of the revolutions of the luminaries of heaven, where Enoch explains to us that he got this information from the holy angel Uriel, who is actually in charge of the luminaries. That's what the book of Genesis means when it says that Enoch walked with God. He was walking with the Elohim that actually told him how the sacred calendar works, along with all of the luminaries of heaven. But anyway, if we drop down to verse 9, we start to hear how it is that the sacred year is to be reckoned. You see if they're talking about the first month in verse 9. Well, in verse 10, you see him saying that the first month is when the sun goes forth through the fourth of the 6 gates. Now, of course, Enoch goes on in this chapter to explain these gates and these portals. And we see that they last either 30 or 31 days. And when we drop down to verses 24 and 25, we see when it is that the sun enters this fourth gate. It is when the days and the nights are equal, talking about the equinox. And that's why there's a lot of confusion around calendars in the year 2021. As it turns out, the Jewish calendar which does not adhere to the book of Enoch, has the first day of the year on March the 14th. But the equinox, the time in which the days and the nights are equal, falls just before March the 20th. So, in other words, the Jewish calendar, which is what they call a fixed calendar, calculated that the first day of the year was before the spring equinox. That's why the Jewish community and those who follow the Jewish calendar are celebrating their feast days a month too early this year. And that's why I'm taking the time to explain this to you, because the way the Jewish calendar works, those who follow it will be celebrating the feast days a month too early several times in a period of about 19 years. But if you know how it all works, you will be able to determine the feast days for yourself. And that's important because we're not always going to have the internet and other communication pathways available to us with people telling us when the feast days are. We really need to learn how to determine them ourselves. And when you look at how they did it back in the old days, like with King Ahaz, they actually used a sundial in order to know when the sun was entering the fourth portal, so that they would know when the beginning of the year was, and they would also know when the feast days was. They used the sun in order to know when the year started, but they used the moon in order to know when the month started. And when we come to the book of Jubilees in chapter 5, we can see that they was using that method of reckoning time all the way back in Noah's day. Matter of fact, let me show you something right quick. We're down here in verse 30, and you see how it's saying that on the new moon of the 10th month, the mountains were seen. And I'm sure you know the story of Noah and how he was on that ark for over a year. Well, it was during the 10th month that the waters were receding far enough that he could actually see the tops of the mountains. But notice here that it says on the new moon of the 10th month in the book of Jubilees. But look at what it says when we come over to the same story in the book of Genesis in chapter 8. It's telling us the same thing when it's talking about in the 10th month, the tops of the mountains were seen, but it doesn't say new moon, it says the first day of the month. So putting these two verses together, what we can prove is that the new moon is the first day of the month. But if you need more proof, let's go to the Interlinear Bible and let's look at Psalms 81 and verse 3. I chose this verse because it has the word new moon, and it also has the word full moon in the same verse. The full moon is Keseh, and it's Strong's number 3677, and you see that it means full moon. But the Strong's number for a new moon is 2320, and its transliteration is Kodesh, and its definition is new moon, but notice that it also says a month. And when you look at the times in which Kodesh is used in the Bible, the majority of the time it says new month. So this too proves that the new moon begins the new month. So with these scripture, we're able to tell how the Father's sacred calendar works. All we do is find the first new moon after the spring equinox, which in the year 2021 fell on April the 13th. So the first day of the first month was April the 14th. And the first day of the second month was May the 13th. And to find out when the first day of the third month is, we'll look at this data from timeanddate.com for the month of June. And we see that the first sighting, the sliver of the moon, should be on June the 11th, which would make the first day of the month June the 12th. And for secondary confirmation, we could come over to renewedmoon.com, where it says that the next expected crescent moon sighting will be on June the 11th. And since Enoch explains to us that the 24-hour period that we know as the day starts at sunset, we know that the sighting of the new moon on the evening of June the 11th marks the beginning of the first day, which will end at sunset on June the 12th. So that would actually be the time of the new moon celebration. The new moon is probably the most overlooked holy day of the sacred calendar. I mean, we hear about feast days and we hear about Sabbath days. Rarely do we hear about people celebrating the new moon, but when we look over in Ezekiel chapter 46 and verse 1, we see that the new moon day is an extremely important day. Verse 1 tells us that it is on the new moon, like the Sabbath day, that the inner court of the temple is opened. And of course, in this day and age, we're talking about the third temple, that spiritual temple which is clothed by our bodies. It is on the new moon day and on the Sabbath day that the inner courts are opened. And we see down in verse 3 that the new moon day, like the Sabbath day, is a day of worship. So looking over here at this calendar, we can see how the biblical calendar works. You have the first day of the month, which is a worship day or the new moon day, and the second day of the month, which is actually the first work day, and the 8th day of the month is the Sabbath day, along with the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th day of the month. So in the month of June, once we have verification that the new moon has been sighted on June the 11th, that will begin the first day and the beginning of the new moon worship day that will last through the daylight hours of June the 12th. In other words, June the 12th is new moon day, that day in which the inner courts are open. That is the day when we can expect communications from the spirit world, as well as a spiritual renewal that takes place every month on the new moon day. That again is June the 12th, starting at sunset on June the 11th. Then notice back at the calendar how the Sabbath days fall on the same day of the week. So starting on the new moon in June, assuming that the moon will be sighted on the 11th, remember that we have to go out there and see it for ourselves, or we have to get some kind of confirmation that the new moon was sighted on the 11th. Reliable confirmation, I must add. If the new moon falls on June the 11th, then the Sabbath days will be on Saturdays starting on June the 19th. And the Sabbath days will continue on Saturdays until we have another new moon. And the Sabbath days will change to either Sunday or Monday, 1 or 2 days later, and that's how it works every month. So be sure to mark your calendars that the Sabbath days will change to Saturdays starting on June the 19th. Now, let's come over and let's look at some interesting events that happened in the third month, the month Sivan. Now, one of the things we see that happened in the third month from the book of Jubilees in chapter 6 is that it was on the first day of the third month that Noah and his 3 sons left the ark. They had actually been on that ark for about a year and a month, but it was on the first day of the third month that they actually left and put their feet on dry land. Now, there is a lot going on in this month, and we won't touch every verse that talks about this month, but one of the most interesting things that happened in the month is that the children of Israel who had just left Egypt arrived at the base of Mount Horeb, which is in the wilderness of Sinai, in the 3rd month. We read that in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 1. And we also see that in the book of Jasher, verse 82 and verse 1. The children of Israel who had just celebrated the feast of Passover in the first month have now reached the wilderness of Sinai in the third month of the same year. And drop down to verse 6 of chapter 82. It says that on the 6th day of the third month is when they got the 10 commandments. That's what Exodus chapter 19 is leading up to. And you see the 10 commandments in the very next chapter, in chapter 20. When we come back to the very first chapter of the book of Jubilees, in the first verse, no doubt, we see that it was on the 16th day of the third month that our father spake to Moses and told him to come up to the mount, where he stayed for 40 days, receiving the 2 tables that we know as the covenant. And we'll talk more about these verses here when we do a class, Lord willing, on the covenant and its relationship to the Feast of Weeks. But while we're talking about that, let's come to the 44th chapter of the book of Jubilees so we can see when the Feast of Weeks is actually supposed to be. We see here that Jacob, or Israel, as his name was changed to, had left Haran on the first day of the third month. Then we see that he offered a sacrifice on the 7th day of that same month. He did so because his son Joseph had invited him to come live in Egypt, but he didn't want to do so before he had instruction from the Most High. So he made a sacrifice on the 7th day of the month, as we see in verse 1. And then we see in verse 3 that he waited 7 days, perchance he could see a vision on whether he should go to Egypt or not. So 7 days from the 7th day of the month brings you to the 14th day of the month. Well, you see in verse 4 that that was the day that he celebrated the harvest festival of first fruits. From this scripture, we understand that the correct day of first fruits is the 14th day of the third month. And we see in verse 5 that it was on the 16th day of the month that the Lord appeared to him and told him to take his entire family down into Egypt. And we see in verse 8 that this is exactly what happened. He left the well of the oath on the 16th day of the third month, and he went into Egypt. Well, I find that interesting that that's the same exact day that Moses was called to the mount to receive the covenant, the 16th day of the third month. But back to this Pentecost thing being on the 14th day of the third month. Now, that should come across as odd to some people, because the Jewish community celebrates the Feast of Weeks on the 6th day of the third month. But we find in the book of Jubilees in chapter 15 that Abram, or Abraham, celebrated the Feast of First Fruits in the middle of the month. Not on the 6th of the month, but in the middle of the month, which is on or about the 14th day of the month. So when we look back at our calendar, we see where the Feast of Weeks falls, and that's on the 14th day of the third month. And it makes sense because the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of First Fruits, like the day of Passover, is a day of sacrifice. And in the old days, it would have been a day when they would have slaughtered thousands of animals, preparing for the holy day, which would have been on the 15th day of the month. So when is the day of first fruits, or the day of Pentecost in the year 2021? Again, assuming that the new moon will be verified on the evening of June the 11th, the 14th day of the month will start on the evening of June the 24th and will last through the evening of June the 25th. So, in other words, the day of Pentecost, or the day of Shavuot, or first fruits, is June the 25th in the year 2021. So, there you have it. the third month. The month Sivan in the year 2021 will begin on the evening of June the 11th, and the new moon day will be on June the 12th, with the Sabbath days falling on Saturday until the next new moon day, and the Feast of Weeks falling on the 25th of the month of June.